Okay, so we can talk about front load. Let me jump to Mike Mauro from Iowa, because you represent another plan, all different from the Ohio plan. Iowa, of course, and New Hampshire
Right.
still go first, but now there's a regional grouping
Right.
that rotates.
The National Association of Secretary of States adopted the plan in 1999. It originally started its development in the mid-90s. Finally got adoption by the group in '99. It basically breaks the country up into 4 geographical areas: the East, the South, the West, and the Midwest. And it would keep Iowa and New Hampshire maintaining their first-in-the-nation status, and they would be drawn by lottery starting in March. It starts the process back in March, and you'd be drawn out of a lottery, and whoever comes first will go last the next time and work your way through. We think it's good. The Secretary of State think it's good because it maintains that first-in-nation status, allows the retail politics, and at the same time brings order to a process geographically. So one section of the country is not being overlooked at one time or another. They all get their chance to be at the top.
The Ohio plan, it would seem, though, places a big premium on small states going first, so they're not overlooked, so they're not trampled, so candidates still come there. Your plan doesn't do that, I gather, because in one of the regions, even though they're rotating, there'd be a mixture of small and large states. So what protects the small states that are, say, in the fourth grouping or the final grouping in your regional plan?
Right, and the Secretary of State's plan, it basically puts it by region, and it takes into consideration Iowa and New Hampshire. The Ohio plan, which is an offshoot that Jim mentioned of the, Bob mentioned of the NASA Secretary of State's plan, brings in South Carolina, brings in Nevada, and it's got some good points to it. I think what we're trying to do is get to some type of plan that brings some order to a process that needs order. You know, as a Secretary of State, people say, you're here as Secretary of State. Election process isn't something you wave a wand and they just show up at the voting booth with ballots and those type of things. It takes planning. And to have election commissioners and Secretary of States try to deal with elections on short notice, not knowing where they're going to be, have candidates try to set their schedules, not knowing when it's going to happen, that's the part that needs to be refined. That's the order that needs to be brought to the process. I think the retail politics is spectacular. I'm also here as the Iowa Secretary of State, and we're trying to maintain, we think, the first-in-the-nation status that we think is important, getting people into the living rooms, candidates an opportunity with lesser-known candidates, not the kind of money that they could have to participate in a California or a Michigan or a Florida. They can drive the state, they can buy the TV time, and then in addition to all those things, what's happening now, in addition to all that, is not only when they're working in Iowa, they are working the country. Because in New York, you're turning it on C-SPAN, on CNN, CNBC, Fox News, whatever the case may be, you're getting that picture of how this person operates in a small setting just like this. So I think it's even better now.
Secretary Mauro makes a really good point. Order and predictability do have a great value in this process. And this time around, you'll notice only Michigan and Florida violated the Democratic rules. 5 states, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, Michigan, and Florida, violated the Republican rules.
No, Iowa and
did I say Iowa? I'm
yeah.
sorry. I did not mean to say Iowa.
And Nevada did not violate
Okay,
the rules.
okay. All right, but 5.
There were 5.
There were
But
5.
there were 5, yes.
Right, I'm not as familiar with the Republican process.
You're showing it. By the end of this hour,
Right,
though, you just never
right.
know.
But
If we live through this, we'll be familiar.
yeah, right. But and I'll get you guys to say Democratic Party instead of Democrat if we live through this. But
Maybe that'll help us live through it.
but with these violations, which can only be overcome if there's a pretty strong consensus between the parties and among the other bodies involved, the state legislatures and the Secretary of State. That's how you get order to the process. That's valuable for the candidates, but I think particularly that's valuable for the electorate so that they know what they're dealing with.
So how do you make this happen? One of the questions was, okay, so the parties can set out rules. You have limited ability to enforce them. You have sanctions at your disposal, but as we saw, some states will just sort of fly in the face of the sanctions and take their chances. We saw where Florida and Michigan, for example, on the Democratic side, moved up, and there was some penalty, but was it enough of a penalty to prevent others from moving up next time around? How do you mentioned state legislatures. A lot of these decisions are going to be made by state legislatures who might act in a partisan way to try and undermine the other party, as was allegedly the case in Florida, for example. So how do you enforce this, and how do you make this happen?
and I'd say a partisan or a parochial way. There may have been partisan influences, but actually, I felt that some of the states that chose to go early simply wanted to get themselves out in front. And I believe there was, and has been, and will continue to be enough of a penalty so that we have the basis for trying to have order in 4 years. But I do think that part of that took place by happenstance. So for example, on the Democratic side, to be very clear about Michigan and Florida, the Rules Committee used the power that it was granted by the National Committee to impose a 100% disqualification of the events that took place outside the rules. Now, that did not have in it a prohibition against campaigning in those states, but the candidates agreed to not campaign in those states, responding to a proposal from Iowa and New Hampshire. That meant that because the Democratic Party did want the voters of of Michigan and Florida to be represented at the convention, that we had to have our very extensive and somewhat contentious Rules and Bylaws Committee meeting at the end of May in order to devise a way to preserve order by having a penalty, and a penalty that really was felt at the convention. There certainly had already been a penalty in terms of focus on those states, in terms of interaction with the candidates in those states, even in terms of the economic effect of there being a campaign in those states. But there needed to be something that would be felt at the convention.
Jim and I think, we've talked about this before, we have an interest in seeing that their rules are successfully enforced.
And we feel the same way about their rules.
And so far, at this point, I think we're both satisfied that they have been enforced, and that helps us go forward in September to revise our rules, because a number of people on our Rules Committee have said, well, you know, if they're not enforced, what are we doing? It doesn't make any difference.